You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we're here to talk about creation and science and origins, evolution, Genesis, all that good stuff. Paul, this is our 27th episode. That means we've been doing this faithfully for an entire year now, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's quite an achievement, I think, for us to be getting an episode out every fortnight. But no, it's absolutely fantastic. We've been doing it for a year, and it's been great. I think it's exceeded our expectations, and it's just been fantastic to see the audience growing and continuing to grow at the moment, isn't it? It's fantastic.
Yeah. And we continue to get really nice emails and comments from our listeners. Keep those coming. You can send those to podcast at coresci.org. That's coresci.org. And you can find that contact information at coresci.org/podcast. I'd like to thank our original producer, Brenna Franz. She was a ministry manager at Core Academy who kept after me to get a podcast going. I am not a podcast guy. I don't really listen to podcasts, so I didn't realize how gigantic this was going to be. I didn't know it was going to blow up like this. Thank you for listening. I'm glad we're doing something that you guys enjoy, and I hope we can keep it up for another year at least.
Yeah, and if anybody is just joining us for the first time, then of course, remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, and hit the notification bell if you're on YouTube. And like and share our episodes, share them with your friends, leave us a positive review if you can. All of that, we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Especially those positive reviews. Those are really helpful to get our podcast noticed by new listeners. So, well, this episode, Paul, we are going to tackle some of those common questions again. We did one of these episodes way back when we first started out, spring of last year, I think. And so we thought it would be a good time to revisit that format and just go through a bunch of really, well, they're not simple, but really quick questions and answers. Any one of these could last for an entire podcast.
Yeah.
And some of these questions are frankly a little boring. I don't know. To us, we live in this world and we think about these things all the time, and but they come up so often. It's pretty clear that people are really curious about this, and really, it's these questions are important to people, and even though we've heard them a million times, doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about them again. So
yeah, that's right.
But I did want everybody to know where we're coming from.
I think we can assume too much, can't we, Todd? Sometimes, because we are so immersed in all of this, and we forget that lots of people out there have just got some fairly basic questions that they just want the answers to, and. Yeah. We can be getting into the weeds, can't we? Of lots of arcane details that other people find less interesting, and forget that they're all of these common questions that actually lots of people just want to, hear what we have to say about them. So.
Yeah, and you're right. We can get into the arcane details, which bore people to death. Anytime you want me to do that, you just let me know, and I will bore you to tears. Believe me. All right, well, let's start off with one for you, a question for you here. Is there geological evidence of a worldwide flood? So I suppose, oh goodness, what does it mean to be geological evidence, I suppose, is where you might begin. But that's a big question. We're not going to answer that in 10 minutes, but see what you can do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the first thing to say is that we'd expect that a catastrophe on the scale and duration of the flood described in the Bible would leave abundant evidence in the Earth's geological record. So we ought to see evidence of such an event.
Sure.
But I think whether we can perceive that evidence in the geological record depends to a very large extent on the interpretive framework that we adopt when we consider the Earth's geology. Most geologists today have adopted what we might call a uniformitarian framework, which basically views present-day processes as the key to then interpreting and understanding how the ancient rock strata were formed. And I think if that's the lens through which we view geology, then it's probably going to be very hard for us to see the evidence of a worldwide flood, even if it's there. If, on the other hand, we accept the Bible's testimony to a worldwide flood, then I think that interpretive lens makes much less sense. Because, a flood of the kind that the Bible describes would have involved processes operating at scales and intensities much greater than any that we observe today. So I guess the question really is, do we see features in the Earth's geological record that are better explained by the catastrophist model of a global flood or by the uniformitarian framework that I've just mentioned? And I think the answer to that is yes, we can perceive features like that in the Earth's geological record. One very obvious example, I think, of an evidence for a worldwide flood is that we see extremely widespread, catastrophically deposited sedimentary strata. This is a pervasive feature of the Earth's geological record. We see many individual rock units which are incredibly extensive geographically. They cover a huge area. Right. Mm-hmm. And they display features that are consistent with catastrophic deposition. So let me give you an example. In the southwestern part of the United States, there is a rock unit called the Shinarump Conglomerate.
Shinarump, that's a great name.
Shinarump. Yeah, it's a great name. And the Shinarump Conglomerate is basically a remarkable sheet-like rock unit that covers parts of northern Arizona, southern Utah, parts of several other states. It's thought that originally it probably covered something like 140,000 square miles. So, this is a huge rock unit. And yet it's not particularly thick. It averages somewhere between about 50 and 100 feet thick. It can reach 350 feet in some places. So it's a relatively thin but extremely extensive rock unit. It's composed of lots of pebbles and cobbles of a very hard rock called quartzite. We also find petrified wood in the Shinarump Conglomerate, including some very large logs. The pebbles that we find don't match any local source, so it looks as if they've been transported some considerable distance before they were deposited, where we find them today. And also, the Shinarump Conglomerate is cross-bedded, so it has this inclined layering, within the rock unit, which indicates that it was deposited by fast-flowing water currents. And it's very hard, I think, to visualize how a rock unit like the Shinarump Conglomerate could have been deposited under present-day conditions. We simply don't have any good modern analog for such an extensive blanket of conglomerate. We just don't have anything quite like it today. But on the other hand, if you think about what we might expect from a worldwide flood, then perhaps we can begin to make sense of the Shinarump Conglomerate. It's very broad, sheet-like, extensive nature. The fact that the pebbles and cobbles in it have been transported long distances by fast-flowing water. All of that is exactly what you might expect from a worldwide flood. Now, conventional geologists have tried to explain the Shinarump conglomerate in other ways. They propose, for example, that it was perhaps deposited by a network of braided streams, and that the deposits of these braided streams kind of coalesced to eventually give this very extensive blanket of conglomerate. But it's hard to see how that really explains well the very broad sheet-like nature, the uniform nature of the Shinarump. The fact that
big stream.
And it would covering a very large area, and you'd have to have all those deposits coalesce in a very uniform way. We do see some evidence of channeling in some places, channel erosion below the Shinarump, but in most places we don't. In most places, the Shinarump has a very flat contact with the underlying rocks, which is not really what you'd expect of a braided stream network. So, it seems to me that you look at a rock unit like that, and I can see that a worldwide flood could explain how a rock unit like that formed. And it's one of many, many similar examples. This is not a unique example. The other thing, probably worth mentioning, we've been talking about the remarkable persistence of an individual rock unit there. But also we see some pretty astonishing global scale patterns in the geological record. So, for example, since the 1960s, geologists have recognized that sedimentary rock strata are grouped in thick packages that geologists call sequences or megasequences. They're basically bounded at the bottom by a very extensive regional erosion surface, and also at the top. So we have these erosion surfaces that kind of bound a thick package of sediments. These sequences were first discovered actually by geologists who were working in oil and gas exploration. And a typical sequence comprises, at the bottom you get conglomerates and sandstones, and then they're followed by mudstones or shales, and then those are followed by limestones. That's a sort of a typical sequence. And so what you have there is you have what geologists call a fining upwards sequence. So you have the size of the sedimentary particles gets smaller as you go up through the sequence. So the coarsest material is at the bottom and the finer material at the top. And there are 6 of these mega sequences that have been identified across the North American continent. The lowermost of these sequences is called the Salk Sequence, S-A-U-K, Salk Sequence. And it's represented, for example, in the Grand Canyon of Arizona by 3 major rock units. So at the base of the Grand Canyon, we have the Tapeats sandstone. That's followed by the Bright Angel shale. And then that's followed by the Muave limestone. So there you have your fining upward sequence. There you've got your sandstone, followed by shale, followed by limestone.
Right.
But what's even more remarkable is that Salk sequence can be traced across the whole continent. So the basal sandstone, that's called the Tapeats sandstone in Grand Canyon, stretches right across North America, from west to east, and you also find it from the Mexico border right up into Canada. It's given different names in different places, so it's given lots of different local names, but it's basically all part of a single extensive sheet of sandstone. And then what's even more remarkable than that is that we see similar Salk sandstones on other continents. So, if you go to Europe, or if you go to the Middle East, or to Africa, or to South America, in effect, we have similar sandstones at the same place in the geological record. So this seems to be a kind of transcontinental or global scale pattern. And, when you see global scale patterns in the geological record like that demands a global causative mechanism. And I think that we have that mechanism in the biblical record of a global flood. So I do think, when we look at the Earth's geological record through the right kind of interpretive lens, then I think we do see evidence that's consistent with a global flood.
Yeah. So it's kind of like when you're too close to something, it's hard to see.
Yeah.
That's happened a lot in the history of science, where people don't recognize what they're looking at because it's so large that you can't really take it in very well. Yeah. And so it's not surprising to me that conventional geologists would say, there's no evidence for the flood, because they're thinking of, just a river flood. They've seen those kinds of floods, or a tsunami. They've seen that. So just imagine
so people
big.
So sure. So people are often looking on the wrong scale, right?
Yeah.
So they're thinking, where is this individual flood layer that we should find? They're not thinking on a grand enough scale for something like the global flood described in the Bible. I just think we've got to kind of have a bigger vision in order to perceive what the evidence is really telling us.
Sure. All right, cool. Well, you got a question for me?
I do have a question. We talk a lot about created kinds or baramins. We kind of throw this terminology around a lot. But what does it really mean? That wasn't a play on words, by the way. What does it, what is a created kind anyway? That's basically the question I'm asking. What is a created kind?
What does it mean? So for the rest of you out there wondering where we're laughing at, mean is the Hebrew word that's translated in the English Bible as kind. So what does it mean as a created kind? So, oh goodness. That's a hard question. And we often get criticized for this. And I think it's rather odd the way it's approached. So I've heard people say, you have to give me a formal definition for exactly what it is. And I give them one, and then they just act like that's not good enough. Which, okay, fair enough. Other times I've heard people tell me, until you give me a list of all the created kinds, then there's no point in even talking about it, which I think, well, that's odd. How do we find all the created kinds if we can't talk about and work on it? So it's a funny thing, but okay. So a created kind, the idea came out of studies of species, I guess is the best way to talk about it. So back in the, say, high Middle Ages, just before, say, the Reformation and Columbus voyage and so forth, there were all manner of ideas about how organisms propagated themselves, right? So there was still going around the story that if you had rotten meat and you left it out, it would make flies from the meat. And this was, spontaneous generation. And so these ideas were believed. There were even things that were, recipes for how to make mice. Put your sweaty clothes in a place and make sure it's dark, and then mice will come out of them or something. And and I think it's part of that because people would uncover these mouse nests in their whatever and think, oh, this is where the mice came from. But after a while, people began to, with the scientific revolution, people began to study where critters come from and where animals and plants come from. And in doing so, they would find, okay, well, it's not true. This was sort of a really a milestone in biological science, was finding out that no, in fact, rotting meat does not produce flies. Rotting meat will rot by itself, and the flies are hatched from eggs that are laid on the meat. And this was demonstrated by an Italian guy named Francesco Redi, and it was done in the 1600s. And from there, basically everybody got this idea that, well, if animals come from mommy and daddy animals that are of the same type, then that just goes all the way back to God, right? That just goes all the way back to their origin in, creation week. So that was one idea that was influential in this development of the created kind. The other idea from it comes from studies of species. And so people who began to say, all right, well, if baby animals come from mommy and daddy animals of the same sort, what is that? Well, they called that a species. And then they said, all right, well, let's list all the species. And so in that attempt to list the species, then they discover, oh, this is complicated. There are things that maybe they're good species, maybe they're not good species. And you would have disagreements. One expert would look at a group of creatures and come away with one list of species, and another expert would look at the same group of creatures and come away with a slightly different list, where they would say this version of the species, this version of the creature is a species, and the other person would say, no, it's not a species, it's part of this species, and so forth. So that led to even more study, and plant breeding became really popular especially in England in the 19th century. And so that led to a guy named William Herbert. He was a clergyman who bred amaryllis, which is a flower, right? And so he discovers, oh my goodness, you can make new what appear to be species. You can cross two things, and if you keep working at it over several generations, eventually you'll get an entirely new amaryllis with new properties that breed true. And all of that then sort of feeds into Charles Darwin's perspective on it. And Darwin just said, well, if you can make a new species by breeding, then that could happen in the natural world. And he marshaled a bunch of evidence for that as well. Now, the creationist reaction initially was to sort of just reject what Darwin had said, which basically was because, well, that's just the reaction to one extreme is always to go to the other extreme, right? I mean, if all species evolved from a common ancestor, well, then the right answer must be that no species evolved. They all were created. And eventually, in the 20th century, we had other creationists come along who knew more about species and so forth, and they were able to say, no, in fact, it looks more like there are groups of species that came out of a common created ancestral population, whatever that might be. And that over time, those species have, as they've spread out across the earth after the flood, they've adapted to local conditions, and they've generated new, what we would think of as species. So the created kind is not necessarily a species, but it can often include more than one species. Now, this is all from biology, right? This is all just working out biology and working out how that might relate to the way God describes things in Genesis. So when God creates in Genesis, he creates things after their kind. And you see that phrase repeated often in Genesis. And so that's where the idea of created kind, the terminology comes from. It comes from Genesis 1. And it also comes, you see it again during the flood narrative when Noah is told to take two of every kind aboard the ark with him. That God would bring those animals to him and that he would gather them up and put them on the ark. And so that leads to the idea that well, maybe the ark was not full of millions of species, which is what the critics want to tell us, which is preposterous. But in fact, may have contained representatives of different created kinds that then generated new species after the flood. So it's a synthesis of what we know from biology, that we can reasonably infer and see directly in nature. And it's also putting together pieces of the puzzle, I think, from what this Bible describes about creation and what the Bible describes about the flood. So a formal definition, you might, people have suggested that if two species could interbreed, they must belong to the same created kind. That's one way to recognize one. Another might be, if you think that God creates a created kind to exhibit certain traits and he doesn't want those traits to change, then you might imagine that a created kind has a certain underlying recognizable set of features that you could recognize. And so that leads to various other sort of conceptions of the created kind that we might use to study the fossil record. It all basically comes back to this notion that species are not fixed, they're not permanent, and they're not, they are generated out of sort of regular biological processes that were operating after the flood. But evolution does not go on forever. It's not like all things are related to a common ancestor. So, yeah. And frankly, it's very useful, and it's produced an enormous amount of research over the past 30 years that I've been involved. And, it's been fossil work. People have studied the fossil record for this. People have used genetics to study created kinds. People have used anatomy to study created kinds. There are a host of different approaches to studying created kinds that I think is good, and hopefully we'll start to see some fruit. What's really interesting is when you get a lot of different conceptions and ideas about created kinds that sort of converge on a similar conclusion, which I think is very helpful in thinking about there's something to this rather than just, creationist wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm. So just as it's not always easy to tell exactly what a species is in any particular instance, what you're saying is it's not always easy to tell exactly what a kind is. And so we have to apply multiple criteria.
Yeah.
There isn't one kind of magic bullet that can tell us what a created kind is.
That's right.
And so hopefully, by applying lots of different criteria, we can sort of converge on the right answer.
Right.
And it may well be, it almost certainly isn't true, that the created kind is equivalent to one particular level in the taxonomic hierarchy. So you're saying, you can have multiple species in a created kind, but the created kind could be sometimes a family, sometimes a suborder, sometimes a subfamily. Could be at different levels.
We've come up with different answers for different sorts of creatures too. I mean, it does not seem to be the same across the board, and the number of species in a created kind is not the same. There are some created kinds that have an enormous number of species, a surprising number that I think alarms a lot of creationists. That how could that many species be, descended from a common ancestor from the flood? And yet, I would say most, based on what I know about, say, the mammals, for example, most created kinds have very few species in them, maybe half a dozen or less. So it's uneven. And it's very similar to what you have with species. There are different concepts of what species are. It's not the same for all types of creatures. Species concept among bacterial people who study bacteria, not the same sort of species concepts that you would use in the fossil record, which is not the same sort of species concept that you would use out in ecology and studying organisms in their natural environment. And so just because we don't have it all perfectly pinned down right now doesn't make it any less science.
Sure.
All right.
Okay, you got another question for me?
I think I do. Let me see what I got here on my list. Oh, yes. This is a great one. I get this a lot. And it comes in different forms. But the basic idea is, did the flood form all of the fossils?
Okay. Well, the short answer, I think, is no. But we need to unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
And I think there are sort of various ways you could sort of approach answering this question. I think one thing we can do is we can kind of take a step back and think about, how we understand the geological record as a whole. And in particular, where do we think the flood begins and ends in the geological record? Sure. So we have this thing called the Geological Column, which we've talked about in previous episodes. We did a kind of 2-part series about the Geological Column. Some people can look that up. But basically the Geological Column is a sort of idealized representation, summary of the stack of rock layers and their enclosed fossils that we find in the crust of the Earth. And when we look at that Geological Column, we find that fossils of different types are not uniformly distributed through that column. So, we have different subdivisions based on the types of fossils that they contain. So at the base of the Geological Column, we've got the Precambrian Rocks, and the Precambrian Rocks mostly contain fossils of microorganisms, things like bacteria and blue-green algae and things like that. Near the top of the Precambrian, there are some weird segmented and frond-like animals. I'm not even sure they're animals.
Very weird fossils.
Strange fossils. And then above the Precambrian, we've got what we call the Paleozoic. And the Paleozoic contains mostly marine fossils. So we have the first appearance of hard-shelled animals at the base of the Paleozoic. And then a bit later we get things like fishes, and then we get some amphibians, and later on even some reptiles. Then we've got the Mesozoic rock layers, and those are kind of dominated by reptile-type faunas. So we've got dinosaurs and pterosaurs, and we've got marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, as well as invertebrates like ammonites. And then above the Mesozoic, we've got the Cenozoic. And the Cenozoic rock layers have different fossils again. So the Cenozoic layers are typically characterized by mammals and birds and flowering plants and things like that. So we've got this stack of rock layers, we've got the fossils in them, and the creationist looks at that Geological Column, and we interpret it as kind of snapshots of living organisms that were being buried, deposited at particular times in biblical history. Now, given that, as we've already established earlier, that the worldwide flood was this hugely significant geological event, the most significant geological event in the history of the world since the creation, it suggests that we ought to be able to look at that column of rocks and fossils and divide it up into at least 3 parts. We ought to be able to say, look, here's a part of the Geological Column that was formed before the flood, maybe during Creation Week or in the period between creation and the flood. Then there should be a portion of the record, a substantial proportion, that was formed during the flood itself. And then, we should be able to see the part of the record that was formed after the flood.
Okay.
And there's a huge amount of debate among creationists about exactly, where those boundaries lie. Where do we put the dividing line between the pre-flood and the flood, and then the flood and the post-flood? Where do we draw those lines in the record? But I think virtually everybody agrees that at least some part of the fossil record was formed after the flood. whether that's part of the Cenozoic or the whole of the Cenozoic. Those are two popular viewpoints among creationists. But in either of those positions, at least part of the Cenozoic is post-flood. So I think, when we begin to sort of break down the geological column in that way, I think we can see that, sure, there is a substantial part of the fossil-bearing portion of the geological column that was formed during the flood itself. But there are fossils that represent organisms that were buried during residual catastrophic events after the flood, as the Earth was recovering and reaching some kind of new geological equilibrium. Mm-hmm. There were depositional events that were capturing organisms, burying them in the fossil record. And, part of the column may represent organisms that were buried between the time of creation and the time of the flood, especially after the fall.
Yeah, that's a bit, I think, more difficult, would you say, to figure out. I've read a lot of papers about the post-flood fossils. That makes sense to me, but figuring out what's a pre-flood fossil, it seems much harder.
Yeah, and we also have to remember that the Precambrian that we talked about mostly consists of microorganisms.
Yeah.
Right. Are they truly nephesh life?
Right.
So do they even have to be formed after the fall? Could they even have been formed, some of them during creation week itself? There are all kinds of really interesting questions. So it's quite difficult, I think, to sort of unravel all of that. But if we're thinking about the other end of the geological column, we're thinking about the end of the flood and then the post-flood period. I think, all creationists agree that at least some portion of the fossil record was formed after the flood.
Sure.
Even if it was just the Ice Age fossils. Yeah. That's kind of post-flood. So the flood didn't form all of the fossils. It formed a substantial portion of them, but not all of them.
All right, good. All right. Thanks for listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you would like more information about what we discussed today, be sure to check out our show notes at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org.
I think I have another question for you, Todd.
All right.
Now, this one's an interesting one. And it brings us to a very intriguing, puzzling in many ways passage of the Bible, which is Genesis chapter 6, where we read about events that were happening before the flood. And we have this strange reference to the Nephilim.
Yeah.
So, Todd, I don't know. This is probably going to be controversial because there are lots of different opinions about this. But in your viewpoint, what are the Nephilim?
What are the Nephilim? So, so the way it's described, you have the sons of God saw the daughters of man, that they were beautiful, and they took wives and had children. And there were Nephilim in the earth in that day when the sons of God came into the daughters of man. Okay, so what could that be, right? So, first of all, let me dispense with what it is not. It's not aliens. I'm not saying it's aliens. I'm saying it's not aliens. So all you ancient astronaut people, sorry, but no. It's not. Yeah, we're not going there. And frankly, I'm not sure that passage really supports the common idea that they're giants either. There are other places in the Old Testament where it talks about other sorts of people that the Nephilim, that word is applied to them as well, that are giants, but I don't see giants here. And I don't know that we should just take Nephilim to refer to somebody of an unusually large height and stature and build. So what are they? I actually have a video on this on my Ask a Creationist, which is on the Core Academy YouTube channel. So if you want a longer explanation, you can check that out. But basically it comes down to this. There are some people who believe that the sons of God represent the godly line of Seth, and that the daughters of man represent the wicked family of Cain. So basically, you have the Cain and Abel story, and then Adam and Eve have Seth, and Seth is the one through whom Noah is born. That line, Noah is born there. And so people think that, Cain's family is bad because Cain was a murderer, and that Seth's family was good. And so what that describes then, the sons of God, the family of Seth, marrying into the family of Cain and giving up their righteous separation and, basically giving into worldly wicked desires and so forth. And that then is what precipitates the flood, right? Precipitates, that's a good word. That's what brings about the flood, right? And so that's one explanation. And then the other explanation is a little weirder, and I understand that people might have a difficult time following this, but the basic notion is that the sons of God are angelic beings. When we see the phrase sons of God used in the Old Testament, it's used a couple of times, and it usually, you can tell from the passage that it's referring to angels. So there are folks who say, well, these clearly are angels who have abandoned whatever angelic duties they had, took on human form, and had wives and had children. And so I like to think of this as the demon-human hybrid interpretation. That these are fallen angels who've gone ahead and got married and had kids. Now, I grew up thinking that the idea of angel-demon-human hybrids was silly and unbelievable. And I was a Seth-Cain family line mingling guy. I believe that was probably the more likely answer. Now, as an adult, after I finished my schooling and got out and had more time to work on these sorts of issues, I began studying more carefully and realized that the interpretations were essentially equally old. You could go back to the church fathers 2,000 years ago, 1,800 years ago, back basically to the beginning of the church. And you could find church fathers who accepted the demon-human hybrid explanation, and you could find some that accepted the explanation that this was the line of Seth and the line of Cain. So it seemed to me at that point, I just expected, if you go back far enough in time, you would find people who would know what the right answer was, and they would all agree, and then there you go. That would be the right answer, and that's not at all what happened. And so I sort of became agnostic, sort of, on the subject, and I decided, well, I guess I don't know. If the church fathers don't know, then I guess I don't know. Now, in defense of the hybrid idea, I mean, we do have record in the Old Testament of angels appearing in human form, right? So we have, I think, probably one of the more famous examples would be the appearance of three men at Abraham's camp just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they are described as men. Two of them then go down to Sodom to bring Lot out, and they are also recognized as human men. And there are other times in the Old Testament where you see angels appearing, but they, they're recognized as angels, but they're essentially, they take on human form to make their appearance. And so I don't think it's that far-fetched to think that they could be, functional in all human ways, right? And could enter into marriages in that way. So, I don't think it's entirely outrageous to imagine that angels could decide, I don't want to do this angel thing anymore. I'm going to go marry this cute girl and have kids and have a family and so forth. I do want to say one thing before we end this little Q&A, that particular question. The Nephilim, the actual word, we don't really know what it is. Some people want to say that it's this biological thing and it's all very important, and it's not used often enough in the Old Testament or in any other Hebrew literature that we have that we can really say for sure this is exactly what that word means. Basically, for these ancient languages, the more often a word is used, the more you can figure out from the context what it's talking about. But this word is used very, very infrequently, and so it's not clear. It's not clear what it is. It could be another word for mighty men of old, which is how they are described in Genesis 6. So, yeah. So what are the Nephilim? Could be Seth and Cain families getting together. Could be angels and human women getting together. We don't know. But it isn't aliens. It's definitely not aliens. All right.
And it's interesting that you just kind of brought out that it might not mean it might not be a biological designation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It could just mean some mighty men or something like that, because that would sort of make sense given the fact that we have Nephilim apparently before and after the flood.
Right.
And since Noah and his family, the 8 on the ark, are the only ones that survived the flood, presumably the Nephilim before the flood went extinct.
Yeah,
they're gone. And so whatever the Nephilim are, after the flood, they are not genetically continuous with the Nephilim before the flood. There's something else going on.
Right. That is exactly how I would understand it. Yep. That something else has happened after the flood, and it might not be angel, human, or Seth, Cain, that produced those post-flood Nephilim. It could be something else, and that word is just used to describe whatever they are. So,
yeah, very interesting.
All right, should we do one more question for you?
Yeah, why not?
I get this one. I get this all the time. Hey, if the Earth is thousands of years old, then how do you explain carbon dating? Oh, those millions of year old fossils and stuff.
Okay.
Oh my, yeah, that was always painful to hear because I don't know where to begin.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll let you try it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, where do we want to begin? Well, the place I want to begin is to point out the misperception that is kind of embedded in the question.
Yeah.
Which is the idea that carbon dating is somehow used to establish that the world and the fossils are millions of years old.
Right.
Which it is not.
Right.
And there are two reasons why carbon dating is not used in that way. One is that carbon dating can only be applied to samples that contain organic carbon. So we're talking about samples such as shell or wood or bone. Mm-hmm. And that excludes most rocks. So if you're wanting to date, a basalt lava or a volcanic ash deposit, you are not going to be using carbon dating. You're going to have to use some other kind of radiometric method. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, and perhaps even more important, is that radioactive carbon, carbon-14, has a short half-life of only 5,730 years. Now, we discussed the concept of half-life in our recent introduction to geological dating episode. So if you want to sort of go back and have a look at that will explain in a bit more detail what a half-life is. But it's basically the time that it takes for half of any given amount of radioactive material to decay into its stable daughter product. So that's basically what a half-life is. Radioactive carbon-14, has this relatively short half-life. And given that after about 10 half-lives or so, there is no measurable amount of the original material left in the sample to measure.
Okay.
That effectively limits the useful lifespan of radioactive carbon to somewhere between about 50 and 60,000 years or so, depending on the sensitivity of the particular instrument that you're using to measure the radioactive carbon in the sample.
That's not
so
very
for both
old
of those,
at all on the conventional.
That's not very old
scheme. Yeah.
No. So exactly. So if you find carbon-14 in a fossil sample, a measurable amount, then that is evidence that sample is actually geologically quite young. It is not evidence that it is millions of years old.
Okay.
So that's kind of the first thing. We could kind of deal with that misperception.
Right.
But having said all of that, can we say something more about radiocarbon and how it is used and what it can tell us and what some of its limitations are? So let's kind of go back to brass tacks then. So let's think about, how is radioactive carbon-14 formed? Well, it's formed continually in the Earth's upper atmosphere. Cosmic rays bombard the Earth's atmosphere.
Okay.
And those cosmic rays produce subatomic particles called neutrons. And those neutrons collide with nitrogen atoms, nitrogen-14 in the atmosphere, converting those nitrogen-14 atoms to carbon-14. Those carbon atoms then combine with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, CO2.
Okay.
And of course, carbon dioxide gets taken up by plants.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they take up the CO2. And then animals eat the plants. And in this way, the radioactive carbon, along with a whole lot of normal carbon, carbon-12, gets incorporated into the food chain, into the biosphere, the bodies of living things. And while organisms are alive, they continually ingest more carbon-14. Okay, they continually take on more carbon-14, replacing any carbon-14 that is lost by radioactive decay, because the carbon-14 decays, because it's unstable, it decays back to nitrogen-14. But while the organism's alive, it keeps taking in more carbon-14 that ultimately is coming from the upper atmosphere.
All right.
But when the organism dies, so the plant or the animal dies, it stops ingesting carbon-14, right?
True.
But the carbon-14 continues to decay into nitrogen-14. And so, in effect, we can take a fossil sample, a sample of wood or shell or bone, and by measuring the amount of radiocarbon in that sample, knowing the original proportion of carbon-14 to ordinary carbon, carbon-12, we can use that as a kind of clock to work out or to estimate the age of the fossil sample. So that's basically how carbon-14 works. Right. But the thing I suppose to notice is that we have made some crucial assumptions when we try to estimate the age of materials using carbon-14. For example, we have to assume that the production rate of carbon-14 that we measure today has always been the same in the past. Or if it hasn't, then we've got to take that into account, right? If the production rate of carbon-14 has changed, we need to know about that, because it's going to have an impact on how we then estimate our date. We have to assume that the atmosphere has the same amount of carbon-14 in it in the past as today. And we have to assume that the biosphere has always had the same proportion of radioactive carbon to normal carbon as we measure today. So if you look in animals today, I think it's 1 radioactive carbon atom for every trillion carbon-12, something like that. So, we have to assume that that's basically been the same in the past. But in fact, those assumptions aren't strictly correct. We know that they're not strictly correct. For example, we know that carbon-14 concentrations, even in the modern world, vary by latitude and through time and according to sunspot activity and things of this kind.
Huh.
So quite often radiocarbon dates have to be recalibrated to take into account these complicating factors in order to ensure that your date is accurate. And in fact, in the creationist model, there are even bigger potential complicating factors. Probably the biggest is the worldwide flood, which we've talked about earlier in this episode. At the time of the flood, it looks as if an enormous amount of carbon from the biosphere was buried in the fossil record. So a huge amount of carbon was kind of taken out of the biosphere, and it was preserved in the geological record as coal and oil and limestones and other fossil materials. And so the world before the flood, if that's correct, the world before the flood had a huge amount more carbon in it than the modern biosphere, perhaps 200 times as much. What that means is that any carbon-14 produced in the atmosphere would have been diluted by much more normal carbon, non-radioactive carbon.
Right.
And that would mean that the proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in those samples would not be the same as the proportion in modern samples. And it would mean that those fossil materials formed at the time of the flood would actually give ages that were erroneously old.
Right.
They would be too large because we haven't taken into account, this different proportion of C14 to C12. So in the creationist model, we have added complications, even beyond the ones that we already kind of know about, in conventional interpretations of radiocarbon dating. And it means that we also need to have ways of recalibrating carbon dates to take that into account. And that's a huge area of ongoing research. Exactly how do we recalibrate those radiocarbon dates so that they give us real biblical time, real time, rather than an erroneously old radiocarbon age, because of the uniformitarian assumptions that are traditionally made within the carbon-14 method.
Right. All right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, we have reason to believe in the creation model that things that lived close to the time of the flood would have looked already older by radiometric means than they really were.
Yeah.
So that by the time we get their remains today, they look super old, even though they're not that old. I think carbon dating is one of those dating methods that creationists have a pretty good handle on, honestly. The other methods, sort of the uranium methods or something like that, those are I think more difficult. But carbon dating, I think we got a pretty good model. It all sort of fits together with what we know about the flood and so forth. So I kind of like it when people ask me about carbon dating. Well, Paul, I think we're about out of time for this episode. I got one more.
Yeah.
I got one more bonus question that I want to talk about here as we close. And that question I get asked every now and then when I do a public event. Some nice person will take me aside and lean in close and say, "How do you make your money?" And I tell them, I make my money. I I take a salary from Core Academy, and you, I believe, take a salary from BCT.
That's correct.
Creation Trust, right? And those organizations generate their income from, well, our organization mostly gets it from donations from people who support us. We have monthly supporters, and we have occasional supporters, and we do a big holiday fund drive. And I think that's pretty similar to Biblical Creation Trust.
Yep, that's basically it. When people ask me, how do you make your money? I think I'm tempted to say, first of all, that if you want to make money, don't go into creationism.
Yeah, we don't.
But no, you're right. I mean, in terms of how the organizations that we draw our salaries from are supported, yeah, it's basically ordinary people who give to support the work that we're doing.
Yeah. And we bring it up now because, the economy, right? The economy is tight everywhere. Here in the U.S., we're experiencing a lot of inflation and prices are going up. And giving has accordingly gone down. Our donations this year already are down by about a third from where they were this time last year. And that's saying a lot because January and February are usually lousy months for donations. So if we're down even more, we're running a pretty hefty deficit. What about BCT?
Yeah, basically, I think it's pretty much the same picture. That the COVID period has kind of hit our donations. We're down by a significant amount too over the previous year, and I think you're right. I think it's kind of COVID effect, and the people are concerned about their own personal, financial situation and the economy and all of that, and it has an impact, doesn't it, on giving?
Yeah. So we always close our episodes by reminding you listeners that we could use your support, and I just wanted to make that really crystal clear this time. We do depend on the kindness of many supporters, and if you're a monthly donor already, thank you. Thank you genuinely. If you would like to become a monthly supporter, you can find out more about that at our websites for Core Academy. That's coresci.org/connect, where you'll find links to lots of important things. And also you will find a link to how to become a supporter and make a contribution to our work. And Biblical Creation Trust, I think you have something similar.
Yes, if people visit our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org, there's a donate button on the homepage, and if people click on that donate button, it takes them to a giving page, and the giving page explains all of the different options for giving. People in the UK can set up what's called a standing order to make regular gifts, or they can send us a check, or they can make a donation online. And if people are overseas and want to support the work of Biblical Creation Trust, probably the easiest way to do it is via PayPal, and there's a link to our PayPal account so that we can receive money that way as well.
Yeah. So
sorry, I was just one of the things I was going to say is that and just to kind of put this in context, we are relatively small organizations, and we don't have, besides our regular supporters, we don't have any major sources of income and funding. We're not organizations that get big grants from funding bodies, or at least extremely rarely. Nobody at the Templeton Foundation is going to give us a large amount of money, nope. Not unless we start promoting evolution, at least. In BCT, we have a handful of churches who support us, who give regularly to the work. But as you say, it is mostly just regular Christians who want to help us continue to do what we do, as well as just kind of covering the costs of just running and carrying on doing the kinds of things we're already doing. we also, and I know Core Academy is exactly the same. We have lots of ambitious plans of things that we would love to be able to do if we had the resources.
Yep.
So in effect, we don't want to be in a position where we kind of run a deficit, but we just kind of muddle through. What we want to do is have some resources that enable us to expand the work that we do and support more students and do more research and so on. And so we need, in order to do that, we need new sources of funding, beyond our regular support base. So we do need more people effectively to come on board. But the good news, because that all kind of sounds, like terribly pessimistic. Please give us a donation. But actually, what I would say, the positive side of this is that because we are small organisations, actually a small amount of money tends to go a long way.
Yeah.
We love to receive larger gifts, don't get me wrong, but actually what's really crucial to our ministries is small gifts made regularly.
Right.
And I worked out, recently, if 100 people gave Biblical Creation Trust the equivalent of a cup of coffee every week, that would actually have a radical transformative effect on our finances.
Yeah.
And would kind of, give us, a stable situation on which to build.
Yeah.
So I can't emphasize enough that those small regular gifts from ordinary people, really are our kind of lifeblood. They are absolutely essential to us. And because we're here in Britain, we're seeing organizations that are promoting evolution in the churches, promoting evolution to church leaders.
Yeah.
You've got similar organizations there in the States,
Yep.
and they have large amounts of money because, they're funded by big funding bodies, and we are very small by comparison. And so I just can't emphasize to everybody who's watching how much we appreciate every single one of the people who help us to continue doing what we're doing. So if you're already someone who gives to support our work, thank you so much for doing that. We really do value it. And if you're considering, whether your small donation is going to make a difference, let me assure you it absolutely will make a difference to both Core Academy and to Biblical Creation Trust.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, our donation is, our average donation in a month is actually pretty small, like you said. And yeah, we survive on people who are willing to support us at a very meager level. And if you're able to support us more, we appreciate that, and we appreciate you too. But yeah, it doesn't take much to really boost the work of Core Academy and Biblical Creation Trust. So please consider it. Please consider making a contribution, especially at this time of the year when we are experiencing the winter doldrums and the COVID constrictions and all that other stuff that's really slowing us down. So for Core Academy, you'd go to coresci.org/connect. That's coresci.org/connect. That would get you to all of our important pages, including how to become a regular supporter. I believe you have a website as well, Paul?
Yeah, biblicalcreationtrust.org. And as I say, there's a donate button on the homepage that will take you to all of the giving options. And there's loads of other things to explore on our website as well.
All right. Well, we have reached the end of another episode. Next time, we're going to be, I think, talking about a new book that's out about human evolution and how that all fits in with Adam and Eve. So that should be a very interesting conversation. So thank you for joining us, all of you listeners, and thank you for those of you who are supporting us to make this podcast possible. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks.
Yep. See you then.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation and check us out on social media. Thank you.